The advertisement in the Wyoming Territorial Register had cost Calvin Hayes his last $1.75. It was short, brutally honest, and felt like a brand on his soul every time he thought of it. Homesteader seeks wife, must be strong, willing to work, passage paid. He hadn't specified age, or temperament, or anything a man ought to look for in a partner for life. He hadn't because he wasn't looking for a partner for life. He was looking for a pair of hands. He needed someone to milk the 2 scrawny cows that were the last remnants of his father's herd, to help him mend the fences that sagged like tired sighs across his 160 acres, and to provide the presence of a wife the land office required to see his claim as permanent. He was a failure, and the ad was proof. At 28, Calvin looked out at the land his father had broken his back to claim under the Homestead Act, and all he saw was a testament to his own inadequacy. The small clapboard house listed to one side, its porch boards warped. The barn roof had a hole the size of a wagon wheel, a dark mouth open to the unforgiving sky. His father had been a man of vision, seeing a thriving ranch where there was only sagebrush and wind. Calvin, however, only saw the endless, back-breaking labor. He was a cowboy by nature, not a farmer. He knew horses and long drives, not crop rotation and dairy yields. But the land was all he had left of his family, a dusty inheritance of obligation. Therefore, he had swallowed his pride and sent the telegraph that resulted in the ad. He expected a sturdy widow from back east, someone with calloused hands and weary eyes who knew what hardship looked like. He imagined a woman in her 40s, practical and plain, who would see the arrangement for what it was, a business transaction. He had scraped together the passage money by selling his father's good saddle, a betrayal that tasted like bile in his throat. But when the train hissed to a stop at the Rock Creek station, the woman who stepped onto the platform was not a sturdy widow. She was a girl, barely 18, and she was Chinese. She stood alone, a small wooden trunk at her feet, holding a piece of paper with his name scrawled on it. She was slight, almost fragile-looking, in a simple, light brown prairie dress that seemed a size too big for her. Her black hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a smooth, unreadable mask. She didn't look strong. She looked like a gust of Wyoming wind could carry her away. Calvin's heart sank. This was a disaster. A mail-order bride was scandalous enough in a town as small and suspicious as Rock Creek. A Chinese bride? It was social suicide. He could feel the stares of the station master, of the freight haulers loading a nearby wagon. He saw their curiosity curdle into something ugly and sharp. This was 1878. The railroad had been finished for years, but the sentiment against the Chinese laborers who had built it lingered like a bad smell. They were seen as foreign, strange, and temporary, not as wives for white homesteaders. He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the dusty planks. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his for a brief second before flicking down to the paper in her hand. She held it out to him. On it, in neat, careful letters, was his name, Calvin Hayes. Below it, in a different hand, was hers, Leanne. "I'm Calvin Hayes," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He couldn't bring himself to look at her directly. Instead, he looked at her trunk. It was small, too small for a life. "That's all you brought?" She gave a single, sharp nod. Her silence was more unnerving than any protest. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air out of the space between them. He had imagined a negotiation, a setting of terms. He had not imagined this profound, unnerving quiet. He picked up the trunk. It was surprisingly heavy. He gestured with his head toward the buckboard wagon waiting at the edge of the street. "It's a long ride," was all he could manage. The journey through Rock Creek was an ordeal. Every curtain seemed to twitch as they passed. Men stopped their conversations outside the saloon to stare. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, stepped out onto her porch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Calvin kept his eyes fixed on his horse's ears. He could feel Leanne's stillness beside him. She did not shrink or hide her face. She simply sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead, as if the town and its judgment were nothing more than a passing landscape. Her composure was so complete it was almost defiant. It made the hot shame crawling up Calvin's neck burn even hotter. He had brought this on her.
He had paid for her passage, only to deliver her into a pit of silent scorn. The homestead, when they finally arrived, looked even worse than he remembered. Seen through a stranger's eyes, its ruin was absolute. The sun-bleached wood of the house, the leaning fence posts, the dry, cracked earth of the yard, it was a portrait of defeat. He pulled the wagon to a halt and sat for a moment, unable to move. He had to say something. He had to explain. "It's not much," he finally said, the words inadequate. "My father, he had plans. The well is good. The water is sweet. That's the best part of it." Leanne said nothing. She simply slid down from the buckboard, her movements fluid and quiet. She walked to the rickety porch and touched one of the splintered support posts, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She looked out at the vast, empty expanse of his claim, at the distant line of the Laramie Mountains, hazy in the summer air.
Calvin waited for the tears, for the accusation, for the moment she would turn and tell him she couldn't stay. But she did none of those things. She turned back to him, her expression as calm as before. "Where are the cows?" she asked. Her voice was low and clear, with only a slight accent. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to him. The question was so practical, so direct, it cut right through his wall of shame. She wasn't looking at the ruin, she was looking for the work. And in that moment, Calvin Hayes felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a fragile, terrifying sliver of hope. What he did not yet know was that the work she was about to begin would save more than just his cows. It would save him. The first few days were a study in silent observation. Leanne moved through the homestead with a quiet economy of motion that fascinated Calvin. She rose before the sun, her slight figure a silhouette against the pale dawn as she went to the corral. The two cows, Bess and June, were notoriously ill-tempered. They kicked, they balked, they had sent Calvin sprawling in the dirt more than once. He expected to hear the clang of a kicked pail, a cry of frustration. Instead, there was only a low, rhythmic sound. When he finally worked up the nerve to look, he saw Leanne sitting on a small stool, her head pressed gently against Bess's flank, her hands moving with a sure, steady motion. The cow was perfectly still, placidly chewing her cud as if she'd been soothed by a master. Calvin had hired her to milk the cows, but he was quickly learning that he had underestimated what that entailed. She didn't just take the milk, she transformed the entire process. She cleaned the udders with a warm, damp cloth. She spoke to the animals in a low, crooning tone, the words in a language he didn't understand, but the intent as clear as the water from his well. The milk she brought back to the house was creamier, more plentiful than any he had ever managed to get. She would strain it through a clean piece of cheesecloth and set it in the cool darkness of the root cellar without a word. Her silence was a wall he didn't know how to breach. They ate their meals at the small kitchen table with a chasm of unspoken thoughts between them. He would eat quickly, his gaze fixed on his plate. She would eat slowly, deliberately, her chopsticks moving with a delicate precision that made his own use of a fork feel clumsy and brutish. He tried to fill the quiet once. "The milk's good," he'd mumbled. She had simply nodded, her eyes not leaving her bowl. He was the master of this homestead, the man who had paid for her passage, but he felt like an intruder in his own home. She had taken over the domestic sphere with a competence that highlighted his own failings. The house was cleaner. The meals, though simple, were more nourishing. She found a patch of wild mint growing by the well and brewed a tea that settled the sourness in his stomach. The real test came a week after her arrival. A length of fence on the northern edge of his property, the one bordering Jedediah Stone's massive ranch, had finally given way. Calvin had been patching it for years with baling wire and hope, but a summer squall had finished the job, snapping 2 of the posts clean off. His 3 steers, the only beef cattle he owned, had wandered through the gap. Finding them would take the better part of a day. Repairing the fence would take 2 more he didn't have. He was standing there, staring at the ruin of it, a hammer hanging uselessly in his hand, when Stone rode up. Jedediah Stone was a man who seemed to take up more space than he was due. He sat on his big bay horse, his saddle gleaming with silver conchos, his face weathered into a permanent mask of smug superiority. He owned half the county and was hungry for the other half. He particularly wanted Calvin's claim for its reliable well. "Morning, Hayes," Stone said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. He gestured at the broken fence with his riding crop. "Having some trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle," Calvin snapped, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. Stone's eyes drifted past Calvin, toward the house. Leanne had come out onto the porch, holding a basket of laundry. She stood perfectly still, watching them. Stone's lips curled into a smirk. "Heard you got yourself some help. Didn't figure you for the type to order from a catalog, especially not that particular model." The insult was plain. Calvin's hand tightened on the hammer. "You watch your mouth, Stone." "Just an observation," Stone said, his voice smooth as oil. A man in your position can't afford distractions. This land needs a firm hand. It's too much for one man, especially one who's distracted. He let the word hang in the air. "My offer still stands, $500, cash. You could be on the next train out of this territory, free and clear." It was a thief's price, and they both knew it. Before Calvin could spit out a refusal, Leanne began walking toward them. She moved without haste, her bare feet making no sound on the dry earth. She didn't look at Stone. She walked right up to the broken fence and examined the snapped posts. Calvin opened his mouth to tell her to go back to the house, but she ignored him. She ran her hand along the splintered wood, then knelt and tested the tension of the remaining wires. Stone watched her, an amused glint in his eye. "What's this, the new foreman?" Leanne rose and walked to a small copse of aspen trees growing near the creek bed. She chose a young, straight tree, about 4 inches in diameter. Then she came back to Calvin, held out her hand, and pointed at the small handsaw hanging from his belt. Her meaning was clear. Dumbfounded, he unhooked it and gave it to her. She went back to the tree and began to saw. Her movements were not powerful, but they were efficient and precise, using the blade's own weight. Stone chuckled. "Letting your woman do the heavy work now, Hayes? That's a new one." But Calvin wasn't listening. He was watching Leanne. She felled the small tree, then sawed off a length of about 5 feet. She dragged it back to the fence line. Using the back of Calvin's hammer, she drove the new post into the ground beside the broken one. Then, using scraps of wire she had collected, she began to lash the new post to the old one, creating a brace. She didn't just wrap the wire, she wove it in a complex interlocking pattern that tightened on itself, creating a bond far stronger than any simple knot. When she was done, the braced post was rock solid. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was sturdy. It would hold. She stepped back, dusted off her hands, and looked at Calvin. It was a look that said, "The rest is your job." Then she turned and walked back to the house, picked up her laundry basket, and disappeared inside. Stone was silent for a long moment, his smirk gone. He had witnessed the same thing Calvin had, a display of quiet, unshakable competence. He looked from the fence to the house, then back to Calvin. The amusement in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating look. He had come here today expecting to find a man on the verge of collapse. Instead, he had found something new, something he hadn't accounted for. "You think that little trick will save you?" Stone sneered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This land has laws, Hayes. A man has to prove he can work his claim. Properly." He wheeled his horse around. "You do well to remember that." As Stone rode away, Calvin stared at the fence. Leanne's repair was elegant in its simplicity. It was something he never would have thought of. He looked at his own hands, calloused and thick from wrestling with cattle and rope. Then he thought of hers. As he'd watched her work the wire, he had noticed something. There were calluses on her fingers, yes, but they were different from his. They were on the tips of her fingers, small and fine, as if from the constant pressure of a needle, not the rough scrape of farm labor. The realization settled in his gut like a stone. He had hired a bride to milk his cows, but the woman in his house was a complete stranger, a puzzle he had only just begun to see. He had no idea who she was or what she was truly capable of. That evening, the silence in the small cabin was heavier than usual. Leanne had prepared a simple meal of potatoes and salted pork, but Calvin could barely eat. The image of her at the fence, the deftness of her hands, the cool dismissal of Jedediah Stone, it all churned in his mind. He was no longer just ashamed, he was deeply, profoundly curious. He watched her across the table as she ate, her face serene. The quiet that had once felt like a judgment now felt like a mystery he had to solve. After the meal, she began to clear the plates. He stopped her, placing a hand gently on her arm. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily. She froze, her eyes wide. "Wait," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Please, sit." She hesitated, then slowly sat back down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He took a breath, searching for the right words. "The fence," he began. "Where did you learn to do that? With the wire?" She looked down at her hands. "In my village," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We mended many things. Baskets, fishing nets. It is the same principle. A strong knot holds." "And the saw?" he pressed. "You handled it like you'd done it before." A faint, sad smile touched her lips for the first time. "My father was a carpenter. I watched him." The simple answers only deepened the mystery. He looked at her fingers, resting on the worn wood of the table. "Your hands," he said. "I saw them today. The calluses. They're not from farm work." She pulled her hands back, hiding them in her lap, as if he had discovered a shameful secret. For a long moment she said nothing. The only sound was the chirping of crickets outside the open window. Calvin thought he had pushed too far, that the wall between them would go up again, thicker than before. But then she spoke. "Before," she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "my family were not farmers. We were artisans. We worked with silk." She rose from the table and went to the small wooden trunk at the foot of the bed she used in the corner of the main room. She knelt and opened it. From beneath a layer of neatly folded clothes, she took out a small bundle wrapped in plain linen. She brought it back to the table and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a piece of silk, no bigger than his hand. It was the color of a sunset, a brilliant tapestry of gold, crimson, and deep purple. Embroidered on it was a crane, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The stitches were so impossibly fine, they seemed to merge into the fabric itself. It was the most beautiful thing Calvin had ever seen. It radiated a skill and patience that was beyond his comprehension. "My mother taught me," Leanne said, her fingers tracing the bird's wing without touching it. "This was the last piece I made before the floods came. The river took our home, our workshop, everything." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw past the unreadable mask. He saw a profound and weary grief in her eyes. "My family, they had nothing left. The man from the agency said there were men in America who needed wives. He said it was a good life, a chance." The words hit Calvin like a physical blow. He had seen her as a commodity, a pair of hands he had purchased out of desperation. But she was a skilled artist, a daughter from a proud family, cast out by tragedy into his world of dirt and failure. The light brown prairie dress, the severe hair, the silence, it was all a costume, a suit of armor. A knock at the door shattered the moment. It was sharp and official. Calvin's stomach tightened. No one came out to his claim after dark. He opened the door to find a young man from the territorial office, holding a lantern and a sealed envelope. "Calvin Hayes?" the man asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He thrust the envelope into Calvin's hand. "Notice from the land office. You've got a complaint filed against you." Calvin's hands shook as he broke the seal. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. The complaint, filed by one Jedediah Stone, alleged that Calvin's marriage was a sham, a violation of immigration and labor laws designed to secure an indentured servant, not a wife. It further alleged that his claim was not being sufficiently improved according to the terms of the Homestead Act. A federal marshal would be arriving in 1 month to inspect the property and adjudicate the claim. If the findings were against him, he would forfeit the land. It was a death sentence for his homestead. Stone had moved faster and more cruelly than he could have imagined. Calvin could feel the blood drain from his face. He had one option. He could send Leanne away. He could put her on a train, tell the marshal it was all a mistake, and beg for mercy. It was the safe choice, the logical choice. It might even save his land. He looked over at Leanne. She was standing by the table, her hand resting protectively on the small piece of embroidered silk. She was watching him, her face once again calm, but her eyes held a question. She knew. Somehow, she knew the contents of the letter. She was waiting to see what he would do. In that moment, looking at the woman who had soothed his angry cows, mended his broken fence, and shared the ghost of her lost world with him, something shifted inside Calvin. The shame he had felt for so long was burned away by a clean, hot flame of anger. This was his land, and this was his wife. He walked past the man from the office, leaving the door hanging open. He went to the small lockbox where he kept his money. He took out $2 silver, nearly the last of his cash. He walked back to the door. "Tell the telegraph operator I'll be there in the morning," he said to the young man. "I'm sending a message to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. I'll be telling him that my wife and I look forward to his visit." He closed the door. He turned to face Leanne. The cabin felt small, the world outside vast and threatening. He had just declared war on a powerful man, with nothing but a ruined farm and a silent partner as his army. He felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it, a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He walked over to the table. Leanne was mending one of his work shirts, her needle flashing in the lamplight. The stitches were tiny and perfect, a line of impossible neatness on the frayed, worn fabric. She was making something whole again. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, for staying." She looked up from her work, her dark eyes searching his. "This is my home now," she said simply. The honesty of her words, the simple declaration of belonging, undid him. He reached out, his rough fingers gently touching her cheek. She didn't flinch. He saw something in her eyes then, not fear, not pity, but a shared understanding, a partnership. He leaned down, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of quiet reverence. It was soft and brief, a promise made in the heart of a storm. It tasted of mint tea, dust, and the faintest hope of a new beginning. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the dark, rich soil of the garden. It was a garden that hadn't existed the year before. Now, neat rows of peas, beans, and lettuces stretched out in a vibrant green patch beside the house. The change was so profound, it was as if the land itself had woken from a long, troubled sleep. The U.S. Marshal, a stern man with eyes that missed nothing, had come and gone a month prior. He had walked the property with Calvin, his gaze taking in the new, sturdy fences that now properly enclosed the entire 160 acres. The posts were straight, the wire taut and expertly strung. He had inspected the barn, where the wagon wheel hole in the roof was gone, replaced by neat shingles Calvin had spent weeks splitting and laying. He'd looked at the 2 milk cows, now fat and glossy, and the 3 steers, healthy and contained. He'd noted the expanded corral and the small, clever chicken coop Leanne had designed from scrap lumber, which now housed a dozen laying hens. Jedediah Stone had been present, his face a thundercloud. He had pointed and argued, speaking of sham marriages and legal loopholes. But the marshal had been interested only in what he could see. He had peered into the root cellar, filled with jars of preserved vegetables from Leanne's garden.
He had looked at the small stack of pelts from animals Calvin had trapped over the winter, a new source of income. Finally, he had stood on the porch of the small house, which was now level, its post replaced, and looked at Calvin and Leanne standing side by side. "Looks like a working homestead to me," the marshal had declared, his voice final. He had tipped his hat to Leanne. "Ma'am?" Then he had turned to Stone. "I find this complaint to be without merit. Don't waste the government's time again." The dismissal, public and unequivocal, had broken Stone's power in the county. He was no longer seen as an inevitable force, but as a greedy bully who had lost. The community's opinion had turned, just as surely, if more slowly. It had started with Mrs. Gable at the general store. One day, when Leanne came in to trade eggs for flour, the woman had smiled, a real smile. "These are the best eggs in Rock Creek, Leanne," she had said, using her name for the first time. Soon others followed. They saw the tangible proof of hard work. They saw a failing homestead reborn.
The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they changed in tone, from scorn to a grudging, curious respect. Calvin stood by the new fence line, watching Leanne in her garden. She was humming a soft, unfamiliar melody as she gently pressed seeds into the earth. She wore a new dress, the fabric a deep blue he had bought for her after they sold the first of their surplus milk and eggs. He had watched her sew it, the fine, even stitches of familiar comfort. He walked over and stood beside her. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that made his chest feel light. Together they looked out at their land. The grass was greening up, the aspen leaves trembled in the breeze, and the mountains stood sharp and clear against the blue sky. It was the same land he had once seen as a prison of failure. Now it looked like a promise. He thought back to the desperate, shameful advertisement he had placed. He had asked for a wife who was strong and willing to work. He had gotten so much more. He had found a partner whose strength was not in muscle, but in a quiet, unyielding spirit. Her work was not just labor, it was a kind of magic, turning ruin into abundance, silence into peace. He reached down and took her hand. Her fingers, still bearing the fine calluses of a silk weaver, curled around his. A home, he realized, wasn't just a claim or a clapboard house. It was the patient, steady work of two people building something together, a shelter against the wind. It was finding a future in the last place you ever thought to look for one. And a partnership in a person the rest of the world had refused to see. And for Calvin Hayes, that was more than enough.